This is the first video in the M320 series that is part of the DataX curriculum at UC Berkeley. This video introduces Flask. It doesn't look like a very powerful or promising tool, but as you will see in subsequent discussions, videos, and notebooks, Flask can actually be leveraged to do some pretty amazing things. In subsequent modules, you will see that we can use Flask to productionize machine learning models and deploy them in real time, at which point you access them via API calls like you would other web services. We will also see that you can leverage Flask to create dynamic websites using D3 to build your own dashboards and be able to monitor your data, your users, or just create some really cool visualizations for your users to interact with. And all of this on the humble Flask micro framework. If you're watching this video as part of the DataX curriculum, you should have access to a folder or a directory called flask_environment. Within that directory, you should find a folder or directory called Flask test app. And within that folder or directory, if you prefer, you should find an executable called myflask-app.py. Within that same folder, you should find an additional collection of nested folders, mostly venv, which contains our virtual environment, templates, which contains our HTML files, static, which contains our CSS, and then finally myflask-db, which is our database. Usually the first thing that you want to do when creating a Flask environment is initialize a virtual environment. The reason for this is that you want to be able to make the code transferable, meaning that if you have a developer working on a Windows machine and you have a developer working on a Unix machine, you want them to be able to work on the same code without having to worry about dependencies. By loading packages and all the necessary files into the virtual environment, in this case venv directory, you facilitate the process of code sharing as well as expandability, because you're not restricted to a machine. It is all within the environment. The next step that most developers generally follow after initializing the virtual environment is to create the templates folder. The templates folder is named as such so that it is recognized by functions built into Flask. You can name this folder whatever you want, but you will likely need to specify the path of the files in order to be able to execute them. Otherwise, as such, templates is just kind of default that most people use. More on that topic later. The thing that you need to worry about at this point in time is that templates essentially contains HTML files, and these HTML files through the myflask-app.py executable extract information from other folders that is needed in order to realize or execute the templates, and we'll talk more about that. After the templates folder is created, we generally create the static folder in which we store things that are applicable at a global scale or sometimes at a local scale, but it tends to be mostly CSS, at least for this stage. The last piece of the Flask environment that we want to worry about is the database. Generally, what we want to do is either through sqlalchemy or a similar package, we want to enable database creation. You could create the database as you find it most convenient, but experience has shown that if you have the opportunity to declare it within the myflask-app.py executable, that it tends to be easier for you to grasp the association between the components of the Flask environment. In this particular case, we're creating a database called myflask-db.db, which happens to be a SQLite database. You're free to use whatever database you prefer. We just chose this one because of convenience. And these are the components of a bare bones Flask application or website. You have your venv directory or your virtual environment directory, which contains all of the packages, libraries, etc., that are required for you to maintain your Flask app. You then have the templates directory, which contains HTML files that are used to template certain aspects of your website or application. The static folder contains CSS files that enable you to customize the look and behavior of your website. Finally, myflask-db.db is a SQLite database that will store all of the information provided by your users as they interact with your website.